So our last folks to share the stories would be Peter Ebram as well as Barbara Daniel from Frederick, Maryland.
Yep, and so I'll be walking through some talking points, and Barbara's going to jump in as needed. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. My name is Peter Brem. I'm president of the consistory at ERUCC. A little background: Frederick is a city of about 75,000 people located, we call it the gateway to Western Maryland, so we're just south of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The county has been hit by COVID, but it has not been hit as hard as our brethren in Florida and Texas and other places. So it's a thing, but not a really serious thing at this point. So we have to be careful. Our church has about 400 members spanning every generation from babies to octogenarians. So we're real pleased with that demographic. When some time ago, the church installed streaming technology. And so we've been streaming services for some time, and they've been participated by maybe 5 to 10 people on a given Sunday, shut-ins, people who are on vacation, folks like that. Well, when COVID-19 hit and the state shut down all churches, we relied on our streaming technology, and we found that we have now about 150 to 180 people online for those services. They're being supplemented with Zoom coffee hours and Zoom Bible study and other Zoom kinds of things during the shutdown period. The state is now allowing us to open up 50% of our capacity, and our sanctuary can hold 300 people. So by law, by regulation, we can have as many as 150. We're only going to start this Sunday with 50 people, but more on that in a minute. When the COVID-19 issue hit, Reverend Daniel said, all right, I'm going to need some congregational lift here to help do the planning. Appropriately, she wanted the congregation to do the planning and the leadership on this, as opposed to make it all about the clergy or the staff. So we put together a volunteer work group of about 10 congregational members, reflecting all ages, some working, some retired, all kinds of variation in that group. And we started meeting in 2 teams. One was the envisioning team. What would our worship and allied worship spiritual activities look like? And then one on logistics. What are the nuts and bolts of how we're going to get people to stand 6 feet apart? Where do we put the hand sanitizer? Do we have gloves? How are we going to handle all that logistics stuff? So those 2 teams met individually, and then we would meet weekly as well to share ideas and knowledge and compile the results. So as a result, we ended up putting together, and I've put a link to this in the conversation, but putting together a reopening document that one of our team members designed. And as part of that process, we wanted to make sure that we kept our communication up with the congregation. And that was done not only from the pulpit, but also through our bulletin, as well as our weekly e-letter, as well as our monthly e-letter. And again, culminating with this handout document that's posted on our webpage, as well as was supplied physically in the mail to everybody in the congregation. But one of the things that we thought as a group was really important was that we led with the values that were guiding our group. And so this document begins by talking about these values: the love for neighbor, access and equity, social justice, all of these things being tied to our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Because we felt that was an important overlay. It kind of reminds me of the covenant that you talked about a little bit earlier, Jessica. So, with that in mind, all of that has gone out. Last night, we did a walkthrough on how our logistics would work, and we videotaped it. That videotape is going to be made available to the congregation so that people can see what the logistics of coming to church is going to look like starting on Sunday. We're using Eventbrite as a way of having people register for the event so that we know how many people are actually going to be there. And we also created a FAQ for the congregation, because we knew that ask 3 people, get 4 opinions. So we put together our list of, we put out our document, and then if people had a question, a comment, or concern, we created an FAQ that they can build upon on that, so that folks can then see the information and gain that information. I'm at work. All right, so as part of that, some issues I'd like to bring out that we had to wrestle with as a group was, one is that there is no right way to worship. We had some people who say, I'm not coming to church. We had other people saying, I gotta come to church. And so we wanted to honor and respect those 2 perspectives and say, each of us has to make the decision about whether or not the risk reward is something that we can deal with. Our responsibility as a church is to honor both of those, support both of those, make both of those possible, and then if we're in person, make sure that we're physically distanced, and have all other safety precautions. So we are moving forward with what we're calling a hybrid model, where you don't have to be in church physically, you don't have to stay away from church and be online. You can do what's right for you, and we're going to respect and honor that because it's one congregation possibly worshiping in two different approaches. So that was a really important thematic thing that we had to wrestle with and come up with. The other is that we wanted to make sure that people knew that we have to be flexible and adaptable. So our plan calls for 4 steps. Step 4 is we're all back in church together and it's sweetness and light. Step 1 is that we're all at home and the pandemic is upon us. But we have to recognize that, as was mentioned earlier on this call, if I get up to step 3 and bad things happen, I have to be able to move back on that. And then the last is singing. We won't be singing as a congregation. But our choir is still singing at the front of the church, and we'll make sure that they are distanced from us in a way that the aerosol from their singing isn't something that's going to affect the people who are sitting further back in the sanctuary. So that's a tobacco auctioneer's description of what we need and where we're going. But Barbara, any suggestions?
Yep. I just want to let people know the choir is 5 people. It's not the whole choir. It's the singers. Yeah, I saw some of your expressions like, oh dear God, they're gonna. So we have that. The other thing I just wanted to say is that we had this long discussion about protecting the vulnerable people. So we sat there one night and realized if we banned everybody over 60 from coming to church, that took out the organist, the pastor, and all 5 of the singers and the sound people. So like we had to say, okay, how can we protect each other? So we are not changing that group per se. Those singers are staying the same. And that way we all have a trust level with each other about what our activity has been. The other was around our older members. You know, I've been so worried about them. They were going out to the store more than I was, some of them. And we had this I thought it was a very healthy discussion about adults being adults, is that we've gone through a lot of training in the church around active shooter training, about mental health first aid, you know, so we mitigate risks as much as we can, but every time we open our doors, we're taking a risk. So the first 2 people to sign up to come to church this Sunday are in their 80s. And both of them said, please do not make me not come to church. They know the risks. They trust what we're doing. I pray to God everything, as we all, you know, we'll hope will be okay. The other thing I just want to say is I think has been really important for us to own what is right for us as ERUCC, and to respect that the Unitarian Church down the road or the Episcopal Church up the street they're making different decisions, but it's based on who they are. So I'm really grateful to my clergy colleagues that we're all very respectful for where everybody's been. We could have been open the end of May, and some churches did open, but we were not ready to do that. And then just something fun for you to think about was, you know, you could get little decals and stickers to put all over the place to mark your 6-foot distancing. But one of my friends suggested we get Frisbees. So we have those cloth Frisbees, you know, we put the church logo on them. So we have 100 of them. We can use them outside. We can use them inside. And I think what I'm thinking is, first of all, it was cheaper, but it's also a little fun, you know, so we're going to be nervous, but to come and see those Frisbees, I think people are going to get a smile, you know, on their face. So I think, yeah, thank you, Peter, for, you know, the outline. And thank you for inviting us to be a part of this call.
So folks, you are a remarkable group of people. And I just first want to express my gratitude for all of you being willing to share your stories. You are coming from a diverse set of churches, of regions, You have different sort of criteria and sense of what is most right for your churches. You have different capacities in terms of building size and tech equipment. And again, the point of this is to share different stories to allow those who have come on and those who'll be watching us later to get a sense of how to make a decision as opposed to what decision to make on this. There are a variety of questions that have been popping up in chat and in the Q&A. Some of those you have been answering as they come along. Thank you for doing that, including providing for a number of folks the links to some of the materials and information you have. I'm trying to go through and see if there's any particular questions that would be helpful to ask. Some of the questions are also technical questions. Again, I don't want to put you into the role of being experts. When it gets to some of those technical questions, I'm going to invite people to return to their own conference staff and their conference websites to get at that. So in other cases, some of these are very specific to the individuals. A couple of folks are asking about the tech equipment that you're using for either live streaming or other things. I'm going to again invite you to go to the website and have that conversation directly with the individual through their website, through the church website, rather than trying to use the time here for that piece of it.
Don, can I say something real quick about youth and children?
Yes, thank you.
Because there was a question about youth and children, and I really think it's important to acknowledge something that we're going to be coming up against here in a couple months, which is that soon we're going to have a situation where we have kids who are overlapping in circles of connection. So when they go back to school, like I'll tell you as a parent, my kids are not going to church. So if they end up going back to school, which we're really not sure of right now, then I'm not also introducing them back into their church atmosphere. So I think that as decision makers, we really need to be careful about how those webs of connection are going to start overlapping. And so as you make decisions about starting up Sunday school, starting up a youth group, ask questions about, first of all, how can you be more creative and do things online? Because I really do think that's going to be right for our youth and children coming up here. But if you can't, then figure out how to do school-based pods. So if you have kids that are in the same school, then keeping those kids together rather than overlapping between schools. Now, in my situation, we have 7 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, and 1 high school. So those are all in my church. And it is just, there's really, and again, this is very settings-based, but I really think that we need to keep that in mind because that can get real dangerous real quick.
So the risk of cross-contamination from kids who have connections in a variety of settings and therefore could bring that illness into the church. Because that question did come up a couple of times, I am curious to hear what other people are doing in terms of how will you be handling church, school, and or youth ministry consistent with your own plans for your church.
So we recognize that our children, it's too hard to keep them away from each other. They love each other. So I just put it in the chat, our children's minister is doing 3 times a week calls with the kids. One's a craft, one's a game, and then one's the lectionary reading for Sunday. So that, and she's had really good response to that. I've done one social kind of distance activity with the youth, and their parents were there to help me monitor, and I didn't have trouble with them staying apart from each other. A lot of them are working. They've got jobs delivering, the takeout food to cars in the parking lot. So Johanna, that was my concern. I had to keep asking the parents, like, tell me what your kid is doing to protect your family if they're going to work. But when I found out like half of them were already working, we figured out how to do some distant games like cornhole and things like that. My fear about the youth, I think the children are more resilient, but I don't know about the rest of you, but we have no national youth event. Now General Synod has been canceled. So all of these leadership nurture opportunities for kids are done for a year. And that's where I'm really struggling. None of them wanted to do the Zoom activity for the National Youth Event. Their hearts were breaking. They didn't want to, you know, so that's my concern around that. So I do think I got to keep them coming together, not every week, but at least to see each other's face, besides the little box on Zoom.
Joe, talk to us about youth. Joe, go ahead.
So our Christian Ed director, who just retired yesterday after 35 years, has been sending out a weekly email to the kids, including all kinds of fun things for them and their families, realizing the kids have a lot of screen time already, and it's really hard for families. And we've hired a new person who's starting tomorrow, who actually is just finishing seminary and will probably be ordained while she's with us, which we look forward to, but is going to focus on, I think, intergenerational ministry with the families to keep them engaged versus just children, because ultimately a lot of the parents have to sit with the kids anyways to keep them in front of the screens or to whatever activities. And so we're going to be working on that. She's going to meet them face to face distantly in our outdoor chapel throughout the summer so she can get to know them and who the families are, et cetera. So that's kind of our plan right now. So we're kind of recreating things, but it's been hard. It's been good to keep it together. Oh, and our CE person also has been doing the last few Sundays a Zoom just for children prior to worship. So about a half an hour before worship, she has been meeting with the kids. And that's been very successful. We'll probably continue that as well.
On to mute. There we go. I mean, mindful of our time and the time that we offered for folks for this. There are a couple of questions that came in through chat that I do want to bring to the group briefly. Again, I'll encourage folks, some of your questions were to specific panelists. Please feel free to reach out to them directly. But also many of your questions are particularly appropriate to bring to your conference staff. These two questions might be helpful to hear. All of you talked about a team of people that you brought on board to think through all the different ramifications, possibilities, and issues that are related to this. And I want to express my gratitude that you didn't leave it to the pastor to do all that decision. You had the wisdom of drawing in the sort of the congregation and a congregational team. One of the people asked, did you also reach out to your insurance company in terms of any liability issues that may be pertinent to the decisions that you are making? And because we all have different insurance companies, it may be the UCC Insurance Board, it may be others. We're just curious to know, did you, yes or no, reach out to your insurance carrier? Yep. Some yes, some no's. All right, excellent. The other question had to do, I was going to address is communion. Have you thought about any particular protocols in communion? That was asked by a couple of people. So let me simply invite as our closing question, any thoughts you have on communion if you're going to be in person?
If I can answer that, or I'm sorry, Jessica, if you want to go?
I'll go and then you can go. How's that?
Okay. Yeah.
We're doing BYOE, bring your own elements. So
Your own elements, okay. George?
Yep. We were going to do the exact same thing. What we ended up creating, which is so amazing, is we went to the dollar store, and for $1, you can buy a pack of small little Tupperware containers. And for another $1, you can buy a pack of 6 little like juice containers or craft containers. And then for another $1, you can buy a pack of about 80 mini containers that go into the smaller container. And so what we do is every month we create what we call a communion kit. It costs altogether maybe 70 cents per kit to make. We have someone who's been making our wafers for years. They're kept in the freezer. And all we do is the day before communion, we have a group of people come in with masks and gloves. They pour juice into the one little container. They put a wafer into the other. They put it into the third container, seal it up. And then as people come into church, those containers are handed to them and they hold on to it. The coolest thing has happened. We've started talking about the theology of communion and how the UCC tends to see communion as a joyful celebration, remembering the meals that Jesus shared. So instead of communion taking 10 or 15 minutes long with ushers serving the elements, we have this moment where we tell everyone to open up their communion kit and there becomes this universal sound that has now become a holy liturgical moment. And while I'm consecrating the elements, the people are invited to themselves take their hand and consecrate the elements. And then after the service is done, they put it in the back of the sanctuary, and immediately our volunteers with their masks and gloves, they wash and dry everything and put it aside for the next month. It has actually taken communion from being the stoic, we don't know why we're doing communion, to this lively, wow, now we understand what communion's about. So it's been a really positive experience. And I have photos I could share to people if they like to see them.
Anybody else want to pipe in on communion?
This pastor listened to the advice of the group and said, we can't handle communion and people coming to church on that first Sunday. So I have a couple ideas that I'm going to float with them. So George, thank you, gave me another one. But I think that was one of the pieces of wisdom that I'm going to carry with me is we can't figure it out all at the same time, and that's okay, you know? So we've been doing communion remotely. I have them make little worship centers at home, but yeah, send any ideas you have then we'll think about how it would work for us. I do know that coming up to the altar rail is not going to work.
I like the wisdom of that comment, and that may be a place for us to bring this to a close. You can't get it all done at the same time at once. There is a lot to be thinking about for what works for your setting, for your context. Again, my appreciation and thanks to all of you who have been panelists for this conversation. You have added to the diversity of our stories, the diversity of our thinkings. And my apologies to those whose questions we could not get to. You had many. I am volunteering the panelists for that, but a reminder to you, they're not there as experts. They simply have their own story to tell. Do turn to your conference staff and folks and your local folks, boards of health, to get the information that be most helpful for your setting. Thank you all for joining us today, and may you find, as the scripture said, the road that God has charted for your church to take. Go in peace. Amen. Thank you.